Right, and with this, I turn to the second part of this lecture, which focuses on the exclusion objection and the theme of discursive equality, given the role of actualist and fundamental public justification in political liberalism. Political liberalism arguably defines the legitimacy of exercises of political power as a function of their justifiability on the basis of a conception of political justice that meets the test of actualist and fundamental public justification. And this just means that political legitimacy here becomes a matter of the equal acceptability of exercises of political power by reasonable citizens. And again, these are citizens that are reasonable in political liberalism's specific sense. These are citizens who do not reject political liberalism's most important liberal political values. It has often been claimed that this makes political liberalism objectionably exclusionary. After all, why should an account of political legitimacy or of the reasonableness of a conception of political justice for that matter, from the ground up, privilege the perspective of people who are reasonable in political liberalism's sense? Doesn't this make it objectionably exclusionary? Shouldn't it be acceptable or justifiable more widely? So, what I want to do in the remainder of this lecture is to consider whether Charles Lamore's hypotheticalizing variant of actualist public justification can accommodate the exclusion objection or help us at least meet that objection. I don't think it can, but it will allow us to bring out some deeper questions about the nature of political liberalism's commitment to equal discursive respect and the kind of discursive equality this is tied to. We shall see that there's a lot of uncertainty here. All right, to put this in context, let me start by asking how actualist and fundamental public justification relates to Rawls's liberal principle of legitimacy, or LPL. According to LPL, political power must be exercised, quote, in accordance with the Constitution, the essentials of which all citizens may reasonably be expected to endorse in the light of principles and ideals acceptable to them as reasonable and rational. Close quote. Now, this refers to principles and ideals that are justifiable as reasonable and rational by a reasonable conception of political justice. And we have just seen, to be reasonable, a conception of political justice must satisfy APJ, or must meet a test of actualist public justification to reasonable citizens. That is to say, it must be equally acceptable coherently by actual reasonable citizens, where this expresses or models a conception constraining idea of equal discursive respect for these actual reasonable citizens. This heralds that Rawls adopts a respect based and actualist form of justificatory liberalism. He takes it that exercises of political power can properly extend equal respect to actual reasonable citizens only if they are justifiable to these citizens on grounds, widely conceived, that actually are equally acceptable by them. And within Rawls's framework, this consideration at once expresses a normative constraint on exercises of political power and a standard of theory selection for the domain of the political. And it's this latter thing that we were focusing on all along. After all, for a theory of justice or political justice to be suitable for the purposes of political legitimacy, it needs to be reasonable in Rawls' sense, or so Rawls would think. So we should select or choose only those theories that can be so reasonable for Rawls. At any rate, central here is the idea that actual reasonable citizens should have some measure of discursive influence at a fundamental level of political justification. In different terms, they should have some measure of discursive power, as Rainer Forss would put it, or a justificatory say of relevant discursive purchase, as I shall refer to it later. What this means is that political power must here be justifiable not simply on the basis of a conception of political justice that relevant people can accept at some level of idealization. Rather, their actual ability or inability to coherently accept a conception of political justice must relevantly impact whether political power may be exercised on its basis. As I read Rawls, this is an important part of the non-domination or emancipation upshot of his idea of political legitimacy. Of course, a flip side of this view is that only reasonable citizens get to have a relevant measure of discursive influence. Only these people are here respected as equal authorities or co-authors of actualist and fundamental public justification. Yeah, so the story seems to be that we need to exercise political power on the basis of a reasonable conception of political justice, but only those people get to have a say on which conception of political justice to use for that role that are reasonable in Rawls' sense. This brings us to the exclusion objection. In one recent form, the exclusion objection is advanced as a stretch of internal criticism. David Enoch argues that political liberalism's restriction of the scope of public justification to reasonable citizens cannot accommodate its own underlying public reason intuitions. What are these public reason intuitions? Roughly, they come down to the twofold view that political power can properly be reconciled with the freedom and equality of relevant citizens only if it is justifiable to them and equally so. On Enoch's reading, political liberalism at least initially aims to reconcile the freedom and equality of all citizens with political power. And as Enoch observes, political liberalism falls well short of that aim. After all, Rawls tries to reconcile freedom, equality, and political power by requiring political power to be justifiable on the basis of a conception of political justice that is equally acceptable by reasonable citizens, or that is equally justifiable to reasonable citizens. However, many relevant citizens are not reasonable in Rawls' sense. And while the equal justifiability of political power to reasonable citizens might reconcile their freedom and equality with political power, it does little to reconcile the freedom and equality of other citizens with political power. And this yields an internal version of the exclusion objection. In essence, the claim here is that political liberalism's exclusionary view of public justification and political legitimacy conflicts with its own initially inclusive commitments. However, the story is slightly more complicated. There is another and perhaps more charitable reading of political liberalism that interprets its understanding of the public reason intuitions in light of the views that it offers in order to accommodate these intuitions. Mesido suggests how we can interpret political liberalism along such lines. He writes that political liberalism respects as free and equal not everyone, but, quote, all those who pass certain threshold tests of reasonableness. We respect those whose disagreement with us does not impugn their reasonableness, close quote. In other words, what political liberalism aims to reconcile with political power is the freedom and equality not of all citizens, but only of citizens that it respects as free and equal, namely reasonable citizens. And this appears to undercut Enoch's criticism. Political liberalism does not initially pursue inclusive aims. It is, from the ground up, exclusionary. However, even if the exclusion objection cannot be made on internal grounds, it still has much appeal. if the legitimacy of political power depends on its justifiability, and if justification must model equal discursive respect, then it seems that political power must be equally justifiable to everyone to whom such respect is owed. But why should it be owed only to citizens who do not reject political liberalism's most important political values? That is, why is it a non-rejection of these things, these values, on which a full justificatory say at a fundamental level of political justification depends? Prior to further argument, it would seem impermissible or, say, unjust, arbitrary, or dogmatic to extend equal discursive respect only to citizens who are reasonable in this sense. Rawls's political liberalism never really responds to this concern, and hence it remains an open question whether it can plausibly meet the exclusion objection. And with this, I turn to the theme of hypotheticalization. Could a hypotheticalization maneuver help to accommodate the exclusion objection? Specifically, could it help actualist public justification to both preserve the priority of reasonableness and become more inclusive in scope? On this matter, Charles Lamore's position is particularly interesting, of course, not only on this matter. Lamore concedes that political liberalism excludes some people in some way. But he also insists that exercises of political power must be justifiable not only to reasonable citizens, but to citizens more general. So how is that possible? Well, Lamore in effect suggests that actualist public justification, or what he calls a rational dialogue, needs to hypotheticalize around its fringes. Thus, in relation to reasonable people, public justification counts toward justification what these people actually can or cannot coherently accept. But in relation to unreasonable people, public justification does not count what these people actually can or cannot coherently accept. Instead, it counts what these people would or would not accept under the counterfactual condition that they were reasonable. Now, it's not entirely clear what this would look like in practice. But what comes to mind is that in public justification, we need to listen to unreasonable people only insofar as this helps to determine what they would say if they were reasonable. And of course, this can be very different from what they actually have to say. In a sense, then, this applies a filter to these people or their voices or perspectives that screens out whatever is or we take to be a symptom of their unreasonableness. Now, Lamore thinks that hypotheticalization is consistent with equal respect. I quote, "The moral idea of respect for persons lying at the heart of political liberalism should be formulated more precisely as follows. The fundamental principles of political society, being coercive in nature, ought to be such that all who are to be subject to them must be able from their perspective to see reason to endorse them on the perhaps counterfactual assumption that they are committed to basing political association on principles that can meet the reasonable agreement of citizens." The second half of this quotation makes the relevant point. Lamore's hypotheticalizing version of actualist public justification, or LJ, as I will refer to it later, accords a justificatory say not only to reasonable people, but it counts exercises of a justificatory say as authoritative only insofar as they are reasonable. The question that I want to consider now is whether this can accommodate the exclusion objection. And one way to pick up the stick is to ask whether LJ could model equal discursive respect, or in different terms, whether it can accord every relevant person an equal justificatory say. Of course, up front, this must be doubtful. After all, the way in which LJ hypotheticalizes continues to give priority to the standpoint of the reasonable. However, on reflection, a much more nuanced assessment is needed. This is because ultimately, it is quite unclear in the first place, what it takes to accord people equal discursive respect or an equal justificatory say. Now, to engage this matter, I need to first say a few things about the idea of discursive equality. And to start with, let me remind you that all acceptability-based justification must somehow or to some degree hypotheticalize, however minimally. This is because it must qualify what kind of acceptances, rejections, or discursive input more generally it recognizes as authoritative or as counting toward the justification status of relevant things. Yeah, so to count toward the justification status of political principles, for instance, acceptances or rejections must be respectable, thoughtful, or coherent rather than, say, inconsistent, irrational, or irresponsible, or what have you. This means, however, that we need to understand the nature of discursive equality against the background of the role of such authoritativeness constraints, which in political liberalism's case take the form of a reasonableness threshold. And as we shall see, this significantly complicates matters. And with this, I turn to the theme of discursive equality. Actualist public justification, we have seen, models an idea of equal discursive respect. It allocates people an equal justificatory say, or at least tries to do so. Now, one important respect, but of course not the only respect, but one important respect in which a justificatory say can be equal or fail to be equal has to do with its discursive purchase. What is that? Roughly, discursive purchase is the measure of influence that an agent's justificatory say allows the agent to exercise in justification or on its outcomes, given the agent's actual deliberation resources. And these resources include the entire range of views, volitions, commitments, capacities, intellectual habits, or informational resources that the agent actually draws on in her attempts to reason practically. Yeah, so discursive purchase as a matter of influence in justification given an agent's actual deliberation resources. Now, discursive purchase comes in degrees. And it's best here to think in terms of some abstract examples. Consider an average person, Betty, who usually reasons in ways that are locally coherent, and consider two justification practices, JP1 and JP2. Both practices count political things as justified only if relevant people cannot authoritatively reject these things. Thus, both practices accord Betty a justificatory say. But the two practices adopt very different authoritativeness constraints. JP1 recognizes rejections as authoritative, or as counting toward the justification status of political things, only if they are locally coherent in light of people's actual deliberation resources. However, JP2 recognizes an agent's rejection as authoritative only if the agent would uphold that rejection if she was ideally rational. Now, for better or worse, JP1 can give Betty's actual perspective or her actual voice more influence or more impact in justification than JP2. JP1 defines authoritativeness in terms that Betty usually meets anyway. Remember, we assume that Betty usually is locally coherent anyway. Thus, if Betty rejects something because she cannot actually accept it coherently, then JP1 counts this as an authoritative exercise of her justificatory say. This makes her justificatory say meaningful. It allows her to easily convert her actual inability to accept phi into discursive input that JP1 recognizes as authoritative or as evidence that phi is not justified, is or is not justified. Things are rather different in JP2. If we assume that average adults are not ideally rational, then JP2 defines authoritativeness in terms that Betty may never actually meet. And this can make it very hard for Betty to convert her actual inability to accept phi into discursive input that JP2 counts as authoritative or as evidence that phi is or is not justified. After all, the fact that Betty cannot actually accept phi does not count against phi so long as it is open whether ideally rational Betty would still reject phi.